The wind howled through the trees, rattling the old wooden fence that barely stood upright. The yard beyond it was a wasteland of mud, scattered trash, and an old, rusted dog bowl, empty like it always was. In the middle of it all, a golden retriever lay curled on the cold ground. His once golden, soft fur was now tangled with dirt, matted and lifeless. His ribs pressed against his frail body, hunger a constant ache in his stomach. The chain around his neck, rusted and heavy, kept him bound to a single spot, his world no larger than a few feet of mud and misery. His name had once been Max, but no one spoke it anymore. Max had been a happy, playful puppy once, full of energy, full of love. But as he grew, his owner lost interest. He became nothing more than a burden, an afterthought. A dog meant to be tied up, left outside, ignored. He had never set foot inside the house, not once. Summer had burned his paws on the scorching concrete. Winter had left his bones aching from the frost. 3 years of suffering. 3 years of watching the world from behind a fence. And yet, despite everything, Max never stopped hoping. Every night, when the lights flickered on inside the house, he lifted his tired head and stared at the door. Would tonight be different? Would his owner finally let him in? But the door never opened. No warm hands reached for him. No kind voice called his name. Just the sound of laughter and life from a home he had never been a part of. Max sighed, lowering his head onto the frozen dirt. He didn't know it yet, but tonight, everything was about to change. The night was bitterly cold. The thin fur on Max's belly did nothing to shield him from the icy ground. He curled up tightly, his tail barely covering his muzzle, as the wind cut through his frail body. The moon cast a faint glow over the yard, illuminating the same dirt he had slept on for 3 long years. Inside the house his owner was warm, comfortable, well-fed. Max lay in the filth, shivering. And yet, he waited. Then footsteps. Max's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't lift his head. He had learned long ago that his owner's footsteps meant nothing. Sometimes they meant a half-hearted toss of leftovers into his rusted bowl. Sometimes they meant angry words, a kick, a sharp yank of the chain. And sometimes they meant nothing at all. But this time, something felt different. The footsteps were lighter, they were hesitant. And then a voice. Oh my God! Max's ears perked up. He lifted his heavy head just slightly, blinking through the darkness. A woman stood by the fence. Her face was barely visible in the dim light, but Max could see the shock in her wide eyes. She gripped the wooden planks tightly, her breath visible in the freezing air. "You poor thing! How long have you been out here?" Max didn't move. He had never heard that tone before. It was gentle, concerned, software. The woman crouched lower, her face close to the gaps in the fence. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." Max stared at her, frozen, not with fear, but with uncertainty. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Then, without thinking, his tail wagged. Just once. It was weak, barely noticeable, but it was the first time in years he had tried. "You don't deserve this," she whispered. Her eyes scanned the yard, the empty food bowl, the tangled chain cutting into his fur, the mud-soaked ground that had been his bed for years. Her face hardened. Then she pulled out her phone. Max watched as she stepped back, dialing a number. "I need help," she said urgently. "There's a dog here. He's starving. He's been left outside for years. I don't think he's ever been inside." Max didn't understand the words, but he understood the urgency in her voice. She cared. His heart pounded. His body was weak, but a feeling long forgotten stirred inside him. Hope. Then, a light turned on inside the house. The woman's head snapped up. A door swung open. Max flinched. His owner stepped onto the porch, his shadow stretching across the yard. His voice was sharp, irritated. "What the hell are you doing?" The woman didn't back down. She squared her shoulders. "This dog is suffering." The man scoffed, rolling his eyes. "He's just a damn dog. He's fine." Max shrank back, ears flat against his skull. He had seen this anger before, but the woman didn't step away. She pointed directly at Max. "He's freezing, starving. You keep him chained up like some forgotten piece of trash." Her voice trembled. "You don't deserve him." Max's owner took another step forward, his jaw tight with irritation. "Lady, this is my damn dog. You need to leave." A tense silence filled the freezing air. Then the woman smiled, not out of kindness, but because she had already called for help. And in the distance the sound of sirens began to cut through the night. "Esse bloco, atende às suas diretrizes? Se aprovado, sigo com o bloco 2. Ha ha. The night air was thick with tension. Max lay frozen in the dirt, his tired eyes darting between the woman by the fence and his owner, who now stood stiff on the porch. Then, a new sound. Sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder. Max didn't understand what was happening, but he felt something shift. For the first time, his owner looked nervous. The woman didn't move. She stood her ground, arms crossed over her chest, her gaze unwavering. "You don't get to treat an animal like this," she said, her voice firm. Max's owner scoffed, but his jaw was tight. "He's my dog. You have no right." Blue and red lights flashed through the cracks in the fence. A car door slammed. Then another. 2 figures stepped into the yard, their uniforms unmistakable. Animal control. Max's ears twitched. He shrank back slightly, his chain rattling against the post. What was happening? One of the officers, a tall man with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Sir, we received a report about an abandoned and neglected dog on your property." Max's owner raised his hands, his voice defensive. "I feed him." The woman let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "When? Last week?" The officer's gaze shifted to Max, scanning his frail body, his tangled fur, the way his ribs pushed through his skin. A flash of sadness crossed his face before he looked back at the man. "This dog is clearly malnourished. He's been left outside in unsanitary conditions. We have every right to remove him from this property." Max's owner's face darkened. "You're not taking my damn dog." The other officer, a woman with a clipboard, stepped forward. "Actually, we are, and given his condition, you could be facing charges for neglect." Max's owner stiffened. His hands clenched into fists. Max didn't move. He had seen his owner's anger before. He knew what came next. But then, a new sound. A soft click. Max's tired eyes widened. The chain was being unclipped. The kind-eyed officer had moved forward, crouching beside him, carefully undoing the rusted metal links that had held him prisoner for 3 long years. For the first time in his life, Max felt the weight disappear. He barely reacted. He had forgotten what freedom felt like. His body trembled as the weight of the chain vanished. He tried to move, to stand, but his legs were weak, his paws unsteady. The woman was by his side in an instant. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered. "You don't have to be scared anymore." Max blinked up at her. Then, a hand touched his head. Gentle, warm, not like his owner's rough grip. Not the hard yank of the chain. This was different. The kind-eyed officer scooped him up, lifting his frail body into his arms. Max let out a weak whimper, his instinct telling him to flinch. But no pain came, only warmth. The officers turned toward the gate, heading for their truck. The woman followed closely, her eyes never leaving Max. His owner stayed frozen on the porch, fists clenched, his face twisted with frustration. "Fine," he spat. "Take him. He's useless anyway." Max's ears twitched. 3 years. 3 years waiting for love. 3 years believing that if he just behaved, if he just waited a little longer, his owner would finally let him inside. But now he knew the truth. His owner had never planned to let him in. He had never cared. Max closed his eyes as the truck door shut behind him. His frail body curled up in the soft blankets the officer had laid down. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sleeping in the dirt. For the first time in his life, he was leaving that place behind. The engine rumbled softly as the animal control truck moved through the quiet streets. The once familiar sounds of the yard, the rattling fence, the wind whistling through broken wood, the distant voices from the house, were gone. Max lay curled on a thick blanket in the back, his frail body rising and falling with each slow, shaky breath. Everything felt different. The cold metal of the chain was gone. The dirt beneath him was replaced by something soft, and the smell of filth and rot had faded, replaced by the warmth of the woman sitting beside him. She hadn't left his side. Her gentle fingers moved slowly through his tangled fur, careful not to press too hard against his thin ribs. "You're safe now, buddy," she murmured. Safe. The word echoed in Max's mind, but it felt foreign. For 3 years, safety had been nothing more than a distant dream, something he had long stopped believing in. Max didn't know what to do. He blinked up at her, his tired eyes filled with uncertainty. Was this real? Would he wake up back in that yard? Would this just be another dream, one that would disappear when the sun rose? The truck slowed, pulling into a driveway. The woman straightened, glancing out the window. Max didn't move as the door opened. A rush of fresh air filled the space, crisp and clean. He flinched slightly as the officer reached for him, but the touch remained gentle. For the first time, someone carried him with care. His frail body was lifted with a tenderness he had never known. The woman led the way toward a small but cozy house, its porch light casting a soft glow against the snow-dusted steps. She held the door open as they stepped inside. Max had never been inside a house before. His paws twitched as he was placed down on a soft rug, the warmth of the room pressed against his cold skin. A fireplace crackled in the corner. A couch sat nearby, blankets draped over its cushions. It smelled like home. But Max didn't understand what that meant. He hesitated. For years, he had been surrounded by cold and dirt, forced to endure hunger and isolation. Was this a trick? Would she suddenly turn and shove him back outside, telling him he wasn't allowed in, that this wasn't for him? His muscles tensed, ready for the worst. The woman knelt beside him, reaching for a bowl of water. "Here, buddy, you need this." Max hesitated again. For years, he had only known dirty rainwater from a rusted bowl. This was clear, fresh, untouched, meant for him. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered his head and took his first sip. The cool liquid coated his dry throat. easing the burning hunger that had been clawing at his stomach for days. The woman smiled, her eyes shining. "Good boy." The words hit something deep inside Max's chest. A good boy, no one had ever called him that before. He paused. Those words, they felt warm, different. He lifted his gaze, staring at her truly for the first time. And then, something unexpected happened. His tail moved. Not much, just a small, hesitant wag. But the woman saw it. Her breath hitched, her hand pressing over her chest. "Oh, Max," she whispered. She reached out, but she didn't force him to come closer. She simply held her hand open, giving him a choice. Max stared at it. For 3 years, hands had only meant pain, punishment, or neglect. But hers was different. His body trembled, his instincts screamed at him to back away, to stay distant. But then he took a chance. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned forward. His cold nose brushed against her fingers, testing, waiting. She didn't pull away, she didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a soft, relieved sigh and gently stroked his cheek. Her fingers moved carefully over his matted fur, touching him in a way no one ever had before. With kindness. "You're safe now." The words made something inside him tighten. Safe. Could he believe it? He wanted to. His tail moved again, a little stronger this time. The woman let out a watery laugh, her fingers trembling as she pet him. "That's it, buddy. You're doing so good." She reached for a small bowl of soft food, setting it near the fireplace. The smell drifted toward him, rich and unfamiliar. Max's stomach clenched painfully. He had gone days, weeks without a proper meal before. But he had also learned that food came with a price. His old owner had tossed scraps at him, but only if he stayed completely still. If he begged, if he moved too quickly, there would be no food at all. So, Max didn't move. He didn't lunge for the food, didn't whimper, didn't lift his head too fast, he just waited. The woman tilted her head, watching him closely. Then, she pushed the bowl closer to him. "It's yours, buddy. You can eat." Max's ears flicked. No conditions, no commands, no punishment. His stomach twisted again. Slowly, so slowly. He lowered his head and took the first small bite. It was soft, warm, real. A quiet whimper escaped his throat as he swallowed. It had been so long since food didn't taste like garbage. The woman smiled through misty eyes. "Good boy." Max paused. There it was again. Good boy. Something inside him cracked, like a wall he had built to protect himself for years. For 3 years he had been treated like nothing, a forgotten soul tied to a post. But here he was somebody. And for the first time in 3 years, he let himself believe it. The days turned into weeks, but the past still clung to Max like a shadow. Emma, the woman who had rescued him, did everything to make him comfortable. She bathed him gently, her hands careful as she rinsed away 3 years of dirt and neglect. She wrapped him in warm blankets, placed a soft bed near the fireplace, where the heat wrapped around him like something he had never known before. And most of all, she gave him kindness. But kindness felt foreign. Max wasn't sure how to accept it. Some nights he still curled into a tight ball on the floor, too afraid to take up space. He flinched when he heard loud noises, his body instinctively bracing for the punishment that never came. And every morning, when Emma opened the door to the backyard, Max hesitated. Because for 3 years, that door had meant goodbye, It meant being shut out. It meant being forgotten. Emma never forced him. She never pulled his collar, never raised her voice. She simply opened the door, then knelt beside him, her voice soft. "You can come back inside, Max. I promise." Max didn't move. His heart pounded in his chest. Could he trust her? Would she shut the door behind him, locking him outside forever? Minutes passed. The wind whistled through the open doorway. Then his paw twitched. Slowly, cautiously, Max took a small step forward. His nails clicked against the wooden porch. His nose twitched, sniffing the air. He turned to Emma, his deep brown eyes searching hers, looking for any sign of a trick. But all he saw was patience, hope, love. Max swallowed hard. Then he stepped inside. The door closed softly behind him. He wasn't locked out. He wasn't left behind. For the first time in his life, he was allowed to come home. Emma exhaled, her smile wide, her eyes glistening. She knelt beside him, pressing a gentle kiss against his damp fur. "Good boy, Max. I knew you could do it." Max let out a quiet sigh. His tail moved. Not weak, not hesitant, but full of something new. Happiness. Yet, even as the days passed, some wounds remained. At night, he still woke up suddenly, his body tense, his ears perked, listening for something that wasn't there. The ghosts of his past whispered in the darkness. Would he wake up back in the cold? Would the warmth of this house disappear? One night, Emma found him standing near the back door, staring out into the dark yard. She approached him slowly, placing a gentle hand on his back. "You're safe now, Max," she whispered. Max turned his head slightly, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers. Was he? Was this truly forever? Emma sat on the floor beside him, giving him space to decide. Max hesitated. Then he made his choice. Slowly, he stepped away from the door and curled up beside her. Emma let out a soft, relieved sigh, running her fingers through his fur. And for the first time, Max didn't flinch. He closed his eyes. He was home. The sun rose, casting a golden glow across the living room. The warmth of morning light danced over the wooden floor, reflecting off the soft fur of a dog who had once only known the cold. Max stretched, his legs still stiff from years of neglect. But this time, there was something different. Comfort. Security. He wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in his life, he had spent the night sleeping on a real bed, a thick, cozy blanket that Emma had laid out just for him. And for the first time, he had slept without fear. No hunger waking him up, no chains weighing him down, no loneliness keeping him frozen in place. Emma walked into the room, a warm mug of coffee in her hands. When she saw Max, her eyes softened. "Good morning, buddy." She knelt beside him, scratching gently behind his ears. Max lifted his head. She spoke to him like he mattered, like he was family. He leaned into her touch, letting himself enjoy the warmth without fear. That was when Emma did something he never expected. She stood, walked to the back door, and opened it. For a moment, Max's heart stopped. He stared at the open doorway, the outside world just beyond it. He had been here before. A door open, an invitation to leave, only to be locked outside forever. His breathing grew unsteady. Would she shut him out again? Would she decide that he wasn't worth it? Emma must have noticed the fear in his eyes because she didn't say a word. She just stepped aside. A choice. For 3 years, Max had never been given one. He swallowed hard. Slowly, he stood up and padded toward the doorway. He hesitated, staring at the yard, the dirt, the broken fence, the place that had been his prison. Then, he did something he never thought he'd do. He turned away from the yard and walked back inside. He made his choice. Emma gasped softly, covering her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. She knelt beside him again, her arms wrapping gently around his thin frame. "You're home, Max. You're finally home." Max let out a deep sigh, the kind a soul releases when it finally feels safe. His tail wagged, not weak, not hesitant, but full of trust, and for the first time in his life, he knew he would never be left outside again. The days turned into weeks. Max grew stronger. His once frail body filled out with proper food and care. His once tangled, dull fur gleamed under the sunlight. But the biggest change wasn't his body. It was his eyes. The fear was gone. The uncertainty had faded. And in its place was trust. Max followed Emma everywhere. If she sat on the couch, he lay beside her, his head resting against her leg. If she walked to the kitchen, he padded after her, his ears perked. And every night when she went to bed, he no longer curled up on the floor, afraid to take up space. He slept in his bed, inside his home, where he belonged. One crisp evening, Emma sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Max lay beside her, his body relaxed, his tail thumping gently against the wood. She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. "You're not the same dog I found that night," she whispered. Max lifted his head, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. She smiled. "You're happy now, aren't you?" "And for the first time," Max answered. He lifted his paw and placed it on her knee. Emma let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes. "I love you too, buddy." The wind was cool, but for Max there was only warmth, because for the first time in his life he knew he was truly home. Max's story proves that every dog deserves a second chance. If this story touched your heart, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Because sometimes saving a dog's life gives them a reason to live.